Sixpence, ninepence, and a shilling. A Southsider's memories of cinema. Nobody who nowadays pauses for a moment, as I often do in my wanderings at the junction of Nicholson Street and Hill Place, would guess for a moment that he or she was standing at a point where at one time a walk of from 15 seconds to 10 minutes, give or take a minute here or there at the top end, would have landed him or her at any one of 11 cinemas. For its size, I am sure the Southside from the Royal Mile to Preston Street had, in those days, more cinemas than any other similar-sized area. It's strange to think now that I knew them, all except 2 which closed before I arrived on the scene, in varying degree from my preschool days until at various times they made the change from silent to talkie, turned to amusement arcade, store or social centre, were taken over by the University or the Salvation Army, or simply, as in at least one case, faded from the scene, leaving no trace. They weren't all on the front street either, mind you, or anywhere near it for that matter. At least 2 of them were right on the doorstep, or perhaps one might say at the stair-foot of many a tenement dwelling, single-end room and kitchen or whatever, in streets where no bus or tram ever ran. Some had, naturally, been theatres. One had been a mission hall. At least 2 had been churches, and yet another, a stone's throw from our stair, had been a synagogue. Some of them were well kept, good family cinemas, in fact. Others were, or latterly degenerated into, the most mephitic of scratchers, flea pits, and bug houses. The Southside was no worse off in this way than a good many other neighbourhoods. You paid your money and you took your choice, although, to be fair, few of them could have been described as being extortionate in their admission charges when we first knew them. If the new Victoria, built in 1930, later the Odeon, was a bit upmarket, your surroundings were worth paying for. The plush atmosphere, the soft lighting, the big lounge and tea room, and the mighty Wurlitzer, of which more anon. Others have written of cinema and theatre in Edinburgh, Albert Mackey, Gordon Irving, Brendan Thomas, etc., but with respect, none of these has made much more than a passing reference to some of the places whose shows kept our parents and later ourselves entertained, thrilled, amused or terrified in the South Side of the 20s and 30s and through the war years. I have no doubt either that a good many old Southsiders even now could recall memories in this field to surpass mine. If so, and should I miss what they clearly remember, I hope they won't be too hard on my attempts. After all, personal impressions differ as much as do personalities. It was in 1927, we are told, that Al Jolson blew the whistle on silent pictures when he uttered his famous double-negative line, "You ain't heard nothing yet." In which case, the revolution was a long time a-comin' as far as the South Side was concerned. Silent cinemas didn't disappear until my infant school days at Drummondy were well advanced. The Old Abbey, for instance, didn't close until 1932. Some of the larger houses installed sound in due course, and bridged the gap more or less smoothly. Other, smaller fry either couldn't afford the installation, or perhaps found themselves in conflict with noise and nuisance bylaws by their proximity to tenement or other dwellings. Either way, they fell by the wayside like the 2 which flourished a while on our doorsteps, and whose patrons thronged in from all the airts, Pleasance, Richmond, Arthur Street, Dummydykes, Holyrood, St. Leonard's, etc., etc. The Abbey and the Roxy. The old Starry in St. Mary's Street had closed long before I started to take notice of things, but my father remembered it from his boyhood in the Dummydykes, and if his account rang true, it must have been a gay rough venue. The seating, he said, was insufferable, the noise at times unbelievable, and the sanitation unspeakable. It seemed that breakdowns were frequent, and at such times the din of catcalls, hoots, whistles, and yells, accompanied by fusillades of nuts, apple cores, clay bulls, bottle tops, and the like, would prompt fearful threats of mass ejection, police action, and worse by the management. There was a similar, though smaller, establishment in Infirmary Street, at the corner of Robertson's Close, and right opposite Southbridge School, oh dear, known as the Waverley. And conditions were similar, if not worse, there. The owner, it seemed, was a rag and bottle merchant, who ran it as an adjunct to his business, and the near riots when breakdowns occurred at matinees would result in the projection box door being flung open, and threats that the owner, manager, checker, usher, projectionist, chucker out. Usually, my father said, just sober enough to stagger through his various duties, would throw yous all out in the bloody shich. The old legend of Jilly-jar admission held true here, it seemed, and the pack-ins at matinees, my father recalled, were even worse than at the Abbey. That redoubtable Southsider, Clegg Kelly, as drawn by S.R. Crockett, would have been as much at home here as in the gaff to which he had the brass neck to take his young Sunday school teacher. Mind you, my father might have been stretching things just a wee. He was yarning of his boyhood to me in 1939, not long before he went to the Seaforths for the second time. The Waverley closed long before my arrival. Well, Brendan Thomas said it was 1922, which predates me by about 3 years. To the great relief, no doubt, of the school authorities across the road, and the kirk folk through the wa next door. Whether either or both of these had any hand in accelerating its departure, I don't know, but it's an interesting thought. Neither I, however, until I heard my dad's tales years afterwards, nor any of my Southie classmates in the 30s, had the faintest inkling that the rather squat building adjoining Lady Yester's kirk, itself once a church, and when we knew it, an electrical workshop and store, had ever been a picture house. An illustration, perhaps, of the improbability of a good many cinema venues in our fathers' and grandfathers' days. It's there to this day, though, looking less like a one-time cinema than ever. Perhaps things had changed, if only a little for the better, by the time my mother or one of my aunts was taking the younger members of the family to any of the smaller houses in the neighbourhood. My first memories being of the Roxburgh, or Roxy, and, just a little later, we went to both until they closed. The Abbey. The Roxy. Almost exactly 80 yards from our stair entry in Adam Street, and no more than 50 yards from the girls' door of Drummondy, on the corner of Roxburgh Street and Drummond Street, actually Roxburgh Terrace, its higher level, now gone, stood a small, rather shabby but popular silent house known to all and sundry as the Roxy. Its proper title was, of course, the Roxburgh Picture House, as indeed its signboard stated, but nobody, in my hearing anyway, ever called it other than by the convenient contraction of Roxy, not to be confused with the establishment built by Mr. Poole years later out at Gorgie. The east side of Roxburgh Street on which it stood consisted mostly of large, flat-fronted early Victorian terraced villas. Some still remain, and it was obvious that the end two of these, the corner one was rather bigger, had had their mutual gable removed somehow, together with the upper floors, to form a fair-sized hall with a small transverse balcony at the Drummond Street end. Its 2 cast-iron supporting columns remained through the Kirklefield College era, and are probably still there. The balcony had a stairway which continued past the big exit door in Roxburgh Terrace, down to basement level, where the toilets occupied a lean-to built across the area. They served the Kirklefield College, which the Roxy became after its closure as a cinema, all through its time, but the lean-to's since been removed. Brendan Thomas's survey gives the Roxy's address as 1 Drummond Street. It was actually 1 Roxburgh Street, The Drummond Street numbers began at the bridges. The other end, the screen end that is, had a mutual gable with the house and surgery of Doctors Julius and Sam Lippitz, two well-kent Southside figures who must have lived and practised in Roxburgh Street for something like 40 years. They were then there when we arrived in 1925. I was 10 days old then, and I'm sure they stayed there until the 60s. This end had an exit door with an iron stairway, also now removed, over the basement area to the pavement. The windows were all, of course, blacked out, whether from inside or outside I can't recall, and there was a large broadside billboard, a 16-sheet I'd imagine, between the middle two pairs, at street level. Changing bills was a ladder job from the area. They might also have had an upright board on the wall facing into Drummond Street, but I could be wrong there. There was no such thing as a neon or light box sign over the heavy stone porch. Simply a big board bearing the words, Roxburgh Picture House, lit at dusk by a bracket lamp with a glass globe. This stayed after the board had been rewritten as Kirkfield College. The board's long gone, but the bracket's still there. The Roxy had, it seemed, been a church. So our next-door neighbour, Mrs. Stoddart, told us, and she'd lived in Adam Street since before the turn of the century. She died while I was still at Drummondy. Its title had been, I believe, the Roxburgh Free Church, and it had joined with another church in the building on the corner of Davy Street, occupied these many years now by the Apostolic Church. The lettering of Roxburgh Buccleuch Free Church could still be discerned through that of Apostolic Church on their portico until recently, when they got a new fascia board. How long previously the Roxy's ecclesiastical phase had been, I don't know, but I was looking at the old place during recent alterations, and where paint was being stripped from the porch, I made out, dimly, following the curve of the lintel, the words Goods Entrance, in rather a dated style of lettering. It looked as though the Roxy had also at some time been a sales depot or warehouse of sorts. Well, that's the chronological detail over with. My first of quite a few memories of the Roxy is of standing with my mother and my brother Tom in a not very long queue one rather cold night. It was election time, it appeared, and as we went up the steps, a column of kids carrying placards and photographs on sticks came marching down Drummond Street under the gas lamps, singing, "Vote, vote, vote for whoever it might have been." My first and by no means my last hearing or singing of that jingle. Going in past the tiny pay box, long gone, it was built over the area from the left side of the porch, and through the inner glass doors you were right into the rear aisle. There was no foyer. The downstairs seating consisted of backed wooden forms stretching from the single centre aisle to either side wall. You just kept squeezing up as the house filled, like a gigantic game of sardines. The balcony might have had seats. Its doorway was on the other side of the rear aisle, but we seldom went there. It was, in the late 20s, my mother recalled, a penny dearer, threepence as opposed to tuppence downstairs. Still, the Roxy seemed to keep its head up pretty well when we first knew it. It could afford a small orchestra, which remained until it closed. First and second violins, cello, piano, and a drummer. This gentleman provided sound effects, gunfire for the westerns, etc. He gave up at war films like The Big Parade. As far as I remember, they weren't a bad orchestra. They seemed to have a pretty big repertoire, and much of the music they played became known to me by name over the years. They rattled out numbers like the Stein song, Here We Are Again, or perhaps Shinaniki Da, for lively sequences in comic films, and items such as Elgar's Salut d'Amour, Handel's Largo, or Mathani's Thai Meditation might accompany church or pastoral scenes. Fight scenes and saloon brawls, or the chase scenes in the westerns, might get anything from the William Tell Allegro to the Bacchanal from the Faust ballet music, while pictures with an Eastern setting would be helped along by bits of ballet Egyptienne, or, of course, in a Persian market. I am sure I first heard the Bakshish Saab theme from that composition in the Roxy. I can't recall all the films we saw. After all, I hadn't started school when my picture experience began, but some stood out vividly, and my mother and I would recall years later. And recently, when television ran programs on Hollywood greats, films, stars and directors, from its early days onward, a lot of memories flooded back into my conscious from then. The Big Parade, for instance, an American war or anti-war film, had one scene vividly recalled in which troops advanced over ground which seemed all on fire, a fire from which, to my horrified eyes, there seemed no escape. Ben-Hur, which alternated between black and white and colour in the oddest way, was another feature in which fire, in this case aboard ship, seemed to rule all. And time and again, the old cliché of the fight in which a lamp was knocked over, setting ranch, palace, garret, hut or hacienda ablaze, would bring gasps from audiences less blasé than today's. Another war epic, Dawn, comes back to mind. The story of Edith Cavell and her execution by the Germans, and one with a lot of aeroplanes in it, perhaps the Skyhawk, were among the war features, of which there seemed to be quite a few, both serious and comic, and for which the band in 1930 were still playing items such as Tipperary, Keep the Home Fires Burning, or The Rose of No Man's Land. This last for the field hospital scenes. Thankfully, though, there was plenty of comedy to balance all this. Chaplin, of course, and others like Chester Conklin, Larry Semon, Laurel and Hardy, and the rest. Saturday mornings were usually matinees for kids, when the programme might differ considerably from what was shown in the evenings. Cowboy films, of course, more Chaplin, etc. I seem to remember at least one Felix the Cat. My brother might take me to one of these Saturday morning séances, while Mum was at the wash-house in Simon Square. It was at one of them that I first witnessed another monumental Hollywood cliché in a Western. The train, headed by one of those huge American locomotives, all domes and pipes, cowcatcher and bell, zooming right out of the screen to the accompaniment of a rip-roaring open roll on the drums and a chorus of shrieks and yells from the juvenile audience. Most of them were probably will use it to such effects, but it was a good chance to let off some steam of their own. I don't think the doctors next door had much peace on Saturday mornings. I just couldn't see a mere mutual gable wall keeping out the hubbub we kids produced, but perhaps Thursday evening, or was it Friday, was worse, as this evening usually featured live entertainment in the shape of a gentleman billed as Fred Knight, the Prince of Chorus Singers. This title was obviously cribbed from Florrie Ford. She was known for years as the Queen of the Chorus Singers. Mr. Knight, I saw and heard him 2 or 3 times, possessed a fair baritone voice, an easy presence, and was, by what I recall of my sight of him round heads and over shoulders, fair and rather stockily built. He would appear from a side door, probably the band room, then would slither, a follow spot picking him up from the projection room upstairs, to the centre of the orchestra pit. It wasn't a pit really, just a railed and curtained enclosure beneath the screen. There was no stage, of course. There simply wasn't room for one. The slide for his opening number would flash on, and he would sing pleasantly, getting the house to follow him on the reprise, which they did readily. One of his numbers, still heard today, was a sentimental ditty in 3/4 time entitled Springtime in the Rockies, and I always associated this tune with the Roxy through the similarity of name in one with subject in the other. Sentimental songs of this kind formed a fair slice of Mr. Knight's repertoire. Just Plain Folks, I'm a-going back to Omaha, Nebraska, Carolina Moon, Keep Shining, etc. The pianist at the Abbey nearby played them too, but the lighter side would inevitably take over with comic, indeed, pure nonsense songs. One of these was a wry commentary on the marriage ceremony and ran thus: How do you feel when you marry your ideal? The reply being, ever so goosey, goosey, goose, goosey, and so forth. The middle 8 bars would continue. Strolling up the aisle in a kind of daze, do you get the wind up when the organ plays? Pure nonsense, but harmless. The maddest of the songs sung by Mr. Knight, though, must surely have given not only the Lippitz brothers, but the whole of Roxburgh Street a real shaking. It was entitled Sitting on the Cold Wet Grass, and ran something after this fashion. I hold her and she holds mine, sitting on the cold wet grass, and the rain goes trickling down my spine, sitting on the cold wet grass. Oh, how can lovers bill and coo, shivering, quivering, ooh, ooh, ooh. All we do is go achoo, sitting on the cold wet grass. I'm sure even now that the achoo from a packed house must just about have lifted all the band's music off their stands and rattled lamps and windows the length of the street, let alone any effect it had on the Lippitz household. And Mr. Knight's wry comment that either side of the house had been, so to speak, sitting on the cold wet grass longer than the other, would result in redoubled efforts at the second chorus. Applause, cheers, shouts of encouragement, calls for requests, and yells of "Youf!" a sort of street cry in fashion among the young bloods of the time, all added to the rammy rising from the crowded forms, which was, however, always good-natured. The slides which accompanied Mr. Knight's songs were colourful items. I couldn't, of course, read the words at first, although I became a quick reader when I started school, but they were illustrated with things like clumps of pine trees with moon and stars shining behind them, rooftops and chimney pots with moon and stars shining behind them, log cabins or cottages with moon and stars shining behind them, and silhouetted couples with moon and stars shining behind them. They seemed to be neatly done. The projectionist might have done them himself. It was a common skill among projectionists then. And their colours, for me, afforded a cheery contrast to the blacks, whites, greys, and occasional sepias of the films. The orchestra were a hard-working lot. Weekday showings were, I'd think, continuous from perhaps 2 o'clock till 10 or half past, and morning shows for us kids on Saturdays made a long day. They didn't seem to have what was then called a relief pianist. At any rate, I never heard the Roxy's piano played solo. All this came to an end when I'd been perhaps a year at Drummondy, fairly late in 1931, I'd think. The Roxy closed. The musicians vanished. The projectionist, I heard years later, went to the La Scala in Nicholson Street, where he remained, it appeared, for something like 30 years, becoming head projectionist there. What happened to the rest of the staff I was never able to find out. Like its near neighbour, the Abbey, the Roxy had been living on borrowed time. A lot of things in the Southside were out of their time in this way. Looking back now, the size of the place wouldn't have justified sound installation, and the noise and nuisance question could have well involved the whole street, let alone the doctors. The front street establishments were all improving their various amenities, as well as going talky. but the replacing of the Roxy's wooden benches with proper seating would very likely have reduced their capacity by something like 40%. They'd probably have had to put in a raked floor too, a big expense. Fire and safety regulations were tightening up, and improved protection and exits for house and projection room would all have added to the bill. The opening of the new Victoria the year before had probably, as Brendan Thomas remarked, dealt the final stroke to the Roxy and its neighbour, which, however, wasn't to bow out until the following year. The old building was to remain, though, to this day, and to contribute to Southside social life from the early 30s through the war years and some time afterwards. Not long after the close down, a workforce descended on the place. The upper floors were replaced, dormers sprouted on the roof, a moderate-sized hall was created at street floor level with classrooms above, and a caretaker's house and other amenities in the basement. On completion of the rebuild, the old Roxy became the Kirklefield College, an adult education and social centre which was to do much good in the district in the Depression years and through the war. The 30s saw day classes in various crafts for unemployed workers. One of the joinery instructors lived up our stair. And evening activities like country dancing, fencing, gym, various classes, orchestra, etc. People came from all over town to this last. The place really came into its own in the war years. It was used, thankfully not for long, as a dispersal venue of my secondary school, which split up into small units in church halls, clubs, etc., as an air raid precaution during the phony war period. Parties, socials, dances, etc., were a great feature of Saturday evenings, Christmas, New Year, etc., and they were nearly all run by local folk. I particularly recall one lady who lived only 3 doors along from the college. There were a few of her kind in the neighbourhood, and the Southside owed much to them. Thursday nights were taken up by the orchestra, up to 50 of them, and they were rehearsed by Dr. John Fairbairn of the university's music faculty. Mr. Mackenzie, the Kirko's second caretaker, would often let me sit in and listen. Blessings on him. The dances and socials were always packed. I even played at some of them after I'd left school. No generation gap was evident at these functions. Young, middle-aged, and old alike danced old-time, modern, reels, Scottishes, and the hokey-cokey, and forgot blackouts, rationing, call-ups, and the rest, at least for an evening. I came home from India to find things much the same in 1948, but again the sands were running out for the Kirko, as they'd done for the Roxy. The council's pre-war plan of building new houses on or near the sites of slum clearance had been ditched in favour of outlying schemes, and the university's own post-war policy of acquiring property in the south side, latterly to prove disastrous, was beginning to gather momentum. These two factors were finally to render the Kirko, like its neighbours, the New College Settlement and the Pleasance Trust, redundant as a social amenity. It became simply another university department. The name was transferred to premises in Guthrie Street. The old Roxy could, on reflection, be described as having been cheap and cheery. Shabby, perhaps, as I said earlier, but it never became the sort of noisome rat hole that some Edinburgh houses were to deteriorate into. The people who ran it couldn't have been a bad lot either. My mother recalled that they stretched a point more than once for me on the all children must be paid for rule, when she took me and Tom along of an evening. And later on, neither he nor I ever paid more than a penny at matinees. The building still stands there on the corner. It hasn't changed much outwardly, although much seems to have been done inside since I began this. I still rub my chin over that sign, though. Goods entrance. Whose? What did they sell? When? That all but illegible lettering, now gone forever in the repainting, continues to intrigue me. The Roxy's near neighbour, again about, say, 90 yards the other way from our stair, outlived the Roxy by perhaps, 2 months or 3, closing, if I remember clearly, early on in 1932. We'd divided our attention and spare coppers pretty equally between the two, though. But my memories of the Abbey in North Richmond Street come back pretty sharply, probably because we paid just a little more attention to this one, it being the cheaper of the two on the whole. So, the Abbey, turning the corner from our stair by Dishington's baker's shop into the long, decaying straggle of North Richmond Street, and crossing to pass the entry of number 26, which led through to the court, one soon came to a building standing between and having a mutual end wall with one of 2 mouldering tenements, all 3 being of a piece with most of the street in that respect. It was on 3 levels. The street floor, from its look, might have been some sort of workshop or store. The upper part, though, did have the look of some sort of place of assembly, which indeed it had been. It had, I learned later, been, among other things, the old Jewish synagogue, although its glory had long departed, nor did it resemble much in our day the place of entertainment it had since become. No light box, neon or bulb-studded lettering beckoned custom from either end of North Richmond Street. Over the door, which didn't differ much in size or appearance from any other stair entry in the neighbourhood, lit by a single dingy bulb in a dirty globe, was nailed a peeling board carrying the legend Abbey, and below, in smaller lowercase, Picture House. There might have been a not very big billboard by the doorway, the sum total of the Abbey's publicity material. No still frames, no star portraits, no coming attraction cards. Passing the rickety folding door, the punter was shot straight up a stone staircase, little different from the one he or she had probably descended 2 or 3 minutes previously, to a landing lit by another dingy bulb, plus a stair gas of the type which fended the gloom in dark stairs and lobbies. There are many such in the neighbourhood. The outside iron stair, recalled by older people long ago, had obviously been before our time. It might have been round in the court. Certainly the North Richmond Street entrance in our day was the interior stair I've described. A left turn through a doorway here, and the punter was at the pay box, literally a sort of box or press, if you like, where admission was paid. The manageress, known simply to us kids as Mrs., performed this duty. I think she did everything except play the piano. After paying and passing the box, patrons were faced by a big baffle board through a doorway. There was another dim bulb here, and walked left or right round either end of this to the not very wide side aisles. There was no centre aisle. If they wanted the gallery, a narrow enclosed stairway, a mere slit, illuminated by a little gas bracket, ran up on the right, turning sharp left, and coming out at the right of the gallery cross aisle. That stair was the only entrance to or exit from the gallery. This ran round 3 sides of the house, which, like the Roxy, followed the line of the street. The downstairs seating was wooden forms. Only the gallery centre, I think, had seats. The downstairs side aisles, I remember, were covered with worn, cracked linoleum of a dull brown with a Greek fret border either side. A common sight in common lobbies, as was the cheap black and white diagonal check stuff on the steps and aisles of the gallery. This latter had probably saved many a tumble on the way into or out of that gallery, for the Abbey, often pronounced Abbey by the way, was dark, far darker than the Roxy. The only illumination downstairs was by a dim gas bracket under either side gallery, and at the rear, the sooty gaslit boxes of the exit signs either side of the baffle board and at the top of the gallery stair. There was another of these over a door in the side wall, I think, under the gallery right of the screen, which probably led into Richmond Court or some back green near it. It was obviously an emergency exit. Perhaps the iron stairway aforementioned led from it, but I never saw it opened, even at a matinee. The Roxy opened theirs regularly. I've often wondered since whether it would have opened readily in any emergency. Looking back, and remembering the pack-ins at matinees and on Fridays and Saturdays, the totally inadequate exits, the two old conical soda acid extinguishers, one in either side aisle under the gas brackets. There might have been one in the piano enclosure as well. And in the evenings, the miasma of Capstan, Woodbine, and Bogey Roll. Such a contingency couldn't have been far round the corner at any time. The Abbey may have stood at a higher level than its neighbour, but in most other respects it came a good many rungs further down the ladder. Grubby, greasy, sleazy. You could have gone through a thesaurus or a dictionary without finding a descriptive in this vein which didn't fit the Abbey in at least one particular. Southsiders, young ones anyway, didn't bother. They simply extended Abbey to Scabby. Nevertheless, the Abbey, when we first knew it, didn't seem to lack for patrons of all ages and, as I said earlier, from all the earths. It was undeniably cheap. It was, like its neighbour, literally on the doorstep for many of them, and no more than 5 minutes' walk for a good many others. Its times of showing were, I think, rather longer than those of the Roxy. It seemed to have a larger variety of films, or perhaps my growing consciousness fostered that impression, and it didn't start to decline until the talkies had taken a firm grip up on the front street. Looking in on recent television programs about old Hollywood, I've seen quite a few films that brought back memories of the old Scabby, and the dates of them brought home the realization that some of them must have been at least 3 or 4 years old when we first saw them in the company of 300 or 400 other Southsiders. Some were, in fact, a good deal older, and one such which had impressed itself firmly on my memory then was shown on Channel 4 some time ago. Its plot concerned a fairground magician and hypnotist who kept a zombie-like creature in his caravan whom he raised to life at night and let loose on the neighbourhood. This monster had, it appeared, fearful designs on a young lady, a young man, of course, attempting to foil the fairground villain and his familiar. Everything in the sets, rooms, corridors, doors, windows, roofs, streets, was warped, twisted, and shadowy. One felt, even I did then, that the ultimate in horror was imminent, but things seemed quite unaccountably, to me at least, to fizzle out at the end in anticlimax. Years later, in 1942 in fact, an old gentleman used to visit the Settlement Senior Boys Club on Sunday evenings after church, bringing a projector and films to illustrate his rather interesting talks on film history. And one evening he produced an item which he explained was an early attempt to show a mentally deranged person's view of the world about him. The director putting himself and his leading actor, as it were, in a madman's shoes. He threaded the lead through, struck up, the lights were doused, and the film began. It was the one we'd seen at the Abbey not long before I started school, the one I saw on Channel 4 quite recently. The young man was the mental patient, the girl a fellow patient, and the satanic hypnotist the director of the mental clinic. That film, a German one, was a lot older than 3 years when we first saw it. In fact, it dated from 1919 and was, of course, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Films of this sort seemed to figure more often in the Abbey's repertoire than in the Roxy's. In fact, anything about ghosts, gothic horror, or whatever seemed far more in keeping with their place of showing there than they'd have been at the Roxy, which had quite a different atmosphere, a thing I seem always to have been sensitive to. The biblical and medieval silent epics, the Flood, Quo Vadis, King of Kings, etc., still come to mind, and others, such as The Wandering Jew, rouse old recollections. This last had one scene, the old man writhing and obviously screaming in torment as the flames leapt round the great cross to which he was chained, which I have never forgotten. Not that I saw much of it. This is where we came in, hadn't become a cliché yet, but Mum acted on it. Chaplin figured more in the Abbey's showings than in the Roxy's, possibly because the latter tended to stay a little more abreast of the times. A good many of the Chaplin films we saw in the Abbey from perhaps 1928, when I began to take notice, until its closure in 1932, were already quite old. Some, in fact, as again the television documentaries show, dated from 1914. Still they were, and are, good for anything from a chuckle to a guffaw. Buster Keaton, Stoneface, Charlie Chase, Ben Turpin, yen I gone for the message and the other yen bringing the change, was how one of my companions described him. Monty Banks, who later became a director and who married Gracie Fields. Lloyd Hamilton, whose golfing antics strangely predated Sid Field's stage act of years later. Fatty Arbuckle, who rocked Hollywood and wrecked his career. And last, though far from least, Harold himself. We saw and roared at them all. One or two of these made it into talkies later. Others who didn't managed, oddly enough, to survive a while in the pages of film fun. Cowboy stars such as Jack Perrin, Jack Holt, Hoot Gibson, and the one and only Tom Mix, who came with his equally famous horse, Tony, to the Empire years later, would figure in the matinee programs which, like the Roxy's, could differ considerably from adult evening showings. High drama with features such as Broken Blossom. Its child star Lillian Gish, now a grand old lady of film, was interviewed by Terry Wogan some time ago, would alternate with swashbuckling items such as the Seahawk or the Gaucho, in which heroic figures like Douglas Fairbanks, Sr., and the three Richards, Dix, Talmadge and Barthelmess, were predominant. None of these gentlemen, I was told, ever employed a double or a stuntman. Another vividly recalled feature which fascinated and terrified me was called, I think, simply the Fire Brigade. Some of it was shown in a television Hollywood documentary a year or two ago. Made in 1927. I was at Drummondy by the time we saw it. This film, on the technical side, was superlative for its day in showing the sort of job a fireman had in some of the older American cities. Scenes and shots, masterfully filmed, showed firefighting in all its dangerous aspects, daring rescues by ladder and jumping sheet, this latter in rescuing a child from an orphanage which had become an inferno, walls and arches collapsing horrifically on hose men battling below. This was to become a horrid reality for Londoners only a few years later. Lifelines fired from guns to reach people trapped at upper windows. All this brought roars of cheering from the matinee audience, whose members had perhaps more appreciation of bravery and self-sacrifice than some folk would have credited them with. The early Our Gang series were often part of the Saturday matinee bill. Evenings too. They were to last into the talky 30s. The Saturday morning Mickey Mouse Club over at Poole's Synod Hall sometimes featured them even in the late 30s, when most of them had most certainly outgrown their roles. And they also figured in the Dandy when that weekly tuppence worth appeared in 1938. Some of them ended up pretty tragically too. I heard years later that one of them, Alfalfa Switzer, had come to a bad end. He'd been shot in a quarrel over a poker game. There was another gang too, perhaps better known to an older, silent generation, whose members got up to such ploys as building their own ship out of junkyard items, scrap timber and the like, and embarking on a hair-raising cruise aboard their creation. If what I recall of some of our later jinks is anything to go on, Southside kids must have hailed this bunch as beings after their own hearts. They were led by a typical Yankee freckle face called Mickey Maguire. What happened latterly to his gang of boys and girls, I don't know, but he's around to this day as Mickey Rooney. One way of keeping the punters coming week by week at least was to include a serial, a following-up picture as we called them, in the programme. I recall 2 or 3 such at the Scabby. One of them featured a girl who always seemed to land herself in the most hazardous of situations, imprisoned in Chinese dungeons with water rising as they were flooded by the baddies, tied to railroad tracks with trains approaching. She managed once, I remember, to free a foot and trip the signal wire, returning the arm to danger before the train entered the section, parachuting out of aeroplanes that had gone on fire. You name it, she'd be in it. For some of her aerial exploits, the pianist would play a number popular in the late 20s entitled Me and Jane in a Plane. Her name wasn't Jane, though. As my mother later recalled, it was Pearl White. Another following up shown with the cowboy items on Saturdays featured a robot figure. Whether goody or baddie I never really puzzled out, but it was universally known as the Iron Man. Indeed, I think that was the serial's title. This monster could shatter doors or rip gates from their hinges with one hand, lift cars off the road, pull down trees and telegraph poles, and, as if all this wasn't enough, administer nasty electric shocks to whoever tried stopping it, simply by pointing a finger at them, from which a huge spark would leap out and send them rolling. No gun, of course, could stop it either. I hope nobody ever gets the bright idea of showing that one to any of Mrs. Thatcher's Home Secretaries. While we're on matinees, though, the Roxy could be rowdy on Saturday mornings, but, true to type, the Abbey could always be relied on to out-Herod its neighbour in that line. For a start, they could, and did, pack more in, with a corresponding rise in the decibel level. Once the forms downstairs and the gallery seats were full, they would sit us on the sills of the boarded-up side windows, 3 or sometimes 4 to a sill. It was sometimes better, even if you did get a left or right cricket neck, to sit apart thus and now and then to watch the heaving, swaying, stamping, cheering, booing and whistling mass in the body of the kirk, whose pressure would sometimes send the hapless laddie or lassie at the end of a row catapulting into the aisle, after which it would be about 50 to 1 anyway, against their ever regaining their few square inches of hard, uncushioned form. You were better off if you got a seat upstairs, as long as it wasn't too far along the sides towards the screen, when the actors would be reduced to Lowry matchstick figures while keeping their true height. There was no differentiation in price on a Saturday morning, and by the time we became Abbey regulars, Jilly Jar admission was going into abeyance. A penny was the flat rate on Saturdays, and while pennies weren't plentiful, a beer or spirit bottle returned to pubs or licensed grocers. Gair's at the corner of Adam Street was our nearest, would see us safely in. The penny on the bottle was a boon to kids in our social stratum. Another point about the gallery was that it was much safer on Saturdays than the body of the kirk. Down there, you never knew what might descend on your skull from upstairs, such activity usually bringing shouts and yells of protest like, "Missus, somebody's spitting out at the corner," or Abelin's, "Hey, jib it up, you yuns up there," with various ornamentation, usually in the form of threats to mally bruise or deal similarly with the perpetrators. Now and then Mrs., I don't think any of us kids knew her name, would switch on the single big bulb that hung from the grimy ceiling rose just clear of the projector's throw, in an attempt to locate and eject the culprits. She was generally unsuccessful, and in any case, this measure invariably produced howls from all sides of, "Pity oot, we can't see the picture," which increased in volume and intensity until the offending luminaire finally was pit oot, if nobody else was. The friendly darkness often helped in paying off old scores against some of the bully boys and hard cases by their account in the neighbourhood. Any such who grabbed a window seat, for instance, especially near the gaslights, could find themselves sitting ducks for missiles of infinite variety from darker corners of the house, or even perhaps a catapulted nut or whatever from the opposite gallery. The sticks and cores of Mr. Lawson's toffee apples, his wee home-made sweetie shop in North Richmond Street, did well out of the scabby, were handy this way. They could be flung like German stick grenades with deadly accuracy. Through all this, scarce heard amid the rammy at times, the pianist played bravely. One Saturday morning, a vendor with a big basket, one of many such, appeared in North Richmond Street as Tommy and I, with one of his classmates, were joining the crowd waiting for doors open. The basket turned out to be full of cellophane packets of multicoloured paper streamers. A halfpenny a packet, no more. This was too good to miss. We joined the mob round the basket, and Tom bought 2 packets, splitting one and giving half to me, the other half to his mate. The hawker soon sold out his stock and moved off, no doubt well pleased with his morning's business. If Mrs. had known what was taking place outside, there mightn't have been any doors opened that morning. The streamers were kept in pockets, up jerseys or down knickers until the show began. Then pandemonium ensued as the packets were produced and ripped open. Streamers were looped an inch or 2 round fingers, then flick thrown in all directions. We were at one side of the gallery that morning, and streamers sliced through the projector beam from both sides, some from ours reaching theirs and vice versa, others subsiding gracefully on the heads below. The downstairs back forms flicked theirs over the front returned the compliment, and the gallery middle seats joined in. Even the piano woman and her piano were liberally festooned in a riot of multi-hued strips. Up went the big bulb. In came Mrs. Some of the bolder spirits were grabbed and pet out. The rest of us were told to cut it out or we'd all join them. The pianist was disentangled from her cocoon. The lights were doused, and the show went on. In retrospect, I suppose it was rather a daft sort of ploy. Not that the streamers were any great danger of themselves, but supposing that somebody had perhaps lit a match in the wrong place at the wrong time. There might have been real trouble then. Not so much from any of the streamers catching fire as from the stampede that would more than likely have followed. The case of a disaster during a matinee at a Paisley cinema some time previously, where 70-odd children had died, not from fire, but from trampling in just such a stampede, brought home to some of us the possibility of such things happening nearer home. A lighter note, though, might be best to remember the old scabby by, whatever shortcomings it may have had. And you'll no doubt have gathered by now that they were far from few. It had, strange to relate, two features which I recall clearly, and which, for me, went a long way to add interest and redeem some of its other faults. A good piano and a good pianist. I've wondered since whether that piano might originally have belonged to the synagogue. After all, synagogues were as much social centres as were any of our churches, and its authorities would have insisted on having a good instrument. Whether or not this was so, the piano was good. There was no tin anywhere in it. It was a far superior instrument to the one in the Operetta House in Chamber Street, which, I recall from 2 or 3 visits before they went talkie in 1931, did tend to jangle. The lady who presided at the Abbey's piano was middle-aged, diminutive, and fragile. She appeared to have some disability, which necessitated her being helped through the little tongue-and-groove board door at the right of the piano enclosure, and onto her stool. Once there, however, her ailment, whatever it might have been, was forgotten. At least so it seemed, in her playing. There's a tendency now, there has been ever since the end of silent pictures, to dismiss a good many of the old cinema pianists as little more than buskers who thumped out stock pieces to accompany stock scenes. And while this may well have been true of some cases, it certainly didn't apply in hers. I don't know whether she could insist on her pianos being well kept and regularly tuned, but it certainly seemed to be, to my juvenile ear at least. And if this was so, it was money well spent. True, she played the popular tunes of the day. They were expected of her, and among these were things like Carolina Moon, Till We Meet Again, Sonny Boy, a little waltz number entitled Molly, I'm So Melancholy, I Don't Know Why, I Just Do, and, ironically enough, If I Had a Talking Picture of You. She did, however, have a wide repertoire of good music, much of which, as with the Roxy's band, I came to know by name later. She also had a rare knack of fitting music to the features and scenes it best suited. One film, for instance, having bullfighting as its theme, probably the Valentino epic, Blood and Sand, and showing about 4 years after his death. I remember I didn't like it. Didn't get the Toreador song banged out to hustle it along. Its accompaniment, I realized years later, was subtly chosen. Music I've since known as being by Granados, Chabrier, and Manuel de Falla, and including items like Andalusia, Jota, Sevillanos, and the bolero rhythm of the Miller's Dance from the Three-Cornered Hat. Comic features and scenes got more than crude slapstick treatment, although she could treat a slapstick scene well. Her hilarious fitting of Offenbach's Apache dance to the roller skating scene with Charlie Chaplin and his feed, the immense Eric Campbell, is one instance which I still recall vividly. Offenbach, Delibes, Rossini, Sullivan, and other like composers were often heard in the Abbey, as were Mascagni, Auber, Donizetti, Bellini, and, of course, Verdi, whose tunes, once described by tenor Frank Mullings as having been hammered out of steel, could point and underline the blood and thunder of the great epics, biblical, medieval, or Western. She must have been a good improviser, too, as necessary a requirement to her job as to the cathedral organist. I'm sure she would have been an asset to any of the bigger front street houses. Perhaps she had been so. The examples I've quoted were a mere drop in a bucket. If, on the odd occasion, the well of ingenuity ran dry, the Roman soldiers in King of Kings jigging along to Scotson Clark's Marche au Flambeau, March of the Torches, a silly little march sometimes played for the marching in and out at Drummondy and Southie, or the U.S. Cavalry in Birth of a Nation, bumping along to the Soldiers' Chorus from Faust. Well, we all have our off moments, and hers were few. Her gifts may well have been wasted on some, please note I say some, of the Abbey's patrons. We weren't all, or anything like all, Philistines, far less barbarians. I never learned her name, although again some old folk years later described her as a genteel body, who spent her spare time, such as it was, in some sort of mission or Sunday school work. She seemed to vanish when the place finally closed, but there may yet be a wheen o' Southsiders besides myself who can call up memories of this lady and her skill. The cards had been up for the Abbey even before we became regulars there. The Roxy was to survive in some form, to serve a community well for 20-odd further years. It wasn't to be so with the Abbey. It was as big a slum as any of the tenements in its immediate vicinity, apart from being an anachronism in other ways. Nobody was greatly surprised when it closed within a month or two of its neighbour. After lying empty a while, the Abbey served a short space as, I think, an annex for the Kirkho's joinery classes. Certainly there were a lot of men working at benches there when some of us looked in, and were duly chased out. But this didn't last long. South Richmond Street, Richmond Lane, and the west side of the Pleasance, opposite the DK, the Deaconess Hospital to you, were already being demolished. I remember, I wasn't quite 8, the Abbey doors being finally nailed and battened up. Some wag later chalked the words, "Shut down for good," on them. And it wasn't me. As the clearance area slowly advanced, demolition was a much slower process then. East, then North Richmond streets, with Richmond Place and more of the Pleasance west side, started to come down. The demolition finally halted within 20 yards or so of East and West Adams streets, which, with Arthur Street, Salisbury Street, Brown Street, the Dummy Dykes, etc., etc., were to remain for 30 years or so yet. With all this went the Abbey. The miracle, or mystery, is that the scabby lasted as long as it did. Its doors didn't close for pictures until 1932. The new Vic had opened in 1930. The new Palace, the High Street, another purpose-built talkie house, opened the year before that, and the Regent, perhaps a 10-minute walk down the Canongate to Abbey Mount, earlier than either of these, in 1927. Other houses in the neighbourhood had gone talkie for over a year, but the Abbey hung on. Perhaps the older patrons still clung to the habit or tradition of having cheap pictures at the stair foot, even if they were a bit old. Radio was still something of a novelty, too. Visible reminders of other past Southside cinemas. The Roxy, the Lyric, the Salisbury, the New Palace, the Cinema House, even the Waverley, which I never knew, linger yet to jog old memories. Not so the old Scabby. It vanished without a trace, and its site would be hard to find today in the now well-tended back greens of the Richmond Place Pleasance Kunselhuses, which replaced the pens, closes, and other slum property of the area. There's one thing, though, which, for me, never fails to bring back a sharp recollection of those daft, glorious days at the Abbey. I've only to see or hear somebody using one of those old hand-pump syringes, and at once an image of Mrs., slowly and solemnly patrolling with hers, Down one aisle, across the front, silhouetted by the pianist's desk lamp, up the other, round behind the baffle, upstairs and across the gallery aisle, comes into focus, together with an echo of the measured whish, 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 as she performed her rite of purification, like some priestess of Hygeia who'd got into the wrong temple. Needless to say, a whole bang-jing of other like images comes with it. Standing once more at the corner of Nicholson Street and Hill Place, and swinging right then left on one heel, you were, until 1931-32, literally within spitting distance of 3 cinemas, each in sight of the other 2. The Cinema House, opposite the Empire Bar, the Rat Trap. The Lyric, over in Nicholson Square. And the La Scala, a yard or 2 the other side of Hill Place. The first 2 closed roughly when the Roxy and Abbey did. The third, a theatre building dating from about 1861, had until recently survived not only its near neighbours, but a good many other Edinburgh cinemas. It's now a betting shop, a far cry from the neat family cinema we knew when my cinema years began, but still holds to the odd vestige of its past, as such places do, for all the attempts at obliteration. The Cinema House. I don't remember very much of the Cinema House, as a cinema, that is. We only visited it twice in my preschool period, and it closed before either of our 2 local silent houses. I've dim memories of, I think, a frame for long strip posters over the door, and of the lettering of these posters being aerograph sprayed, to give them a rounded appearance. I learned that when I became an apprentice poster writer a few years later. It had also, I think, still frames in the inner foyer, but again the memories of it hazy. One visit was in the afternoon, and the film was a tough saga of circus life entitled The Sting of the Lash, of which fights, brawls, intrigues, fire in the big top, stampeding animals, and trapeze act disasters seemed to be the main features. And the only tune the pianist seemed to have up his or her sleeve for the more lively moments of this riot was the gallop from the overture to Zampa. The Cinema House, once the Imperial Hall, was a good deal bigger than the Abbey or the Roxy, with a 3-sided gallery whose centre back was within a recessed arch. It seemed to be fairly well kept, and it might well have had an orchestra in former times. But times had been changing, not for the better as regards cinema, and the inexorable march of sound, among other factors, closed the books on its business, just a little, I think, before the Roxy. Curiously enough, the interesting happenings for me all came about after the closure. Within a short space it had opened again as an amusement arcade, with various slot machines, sideshows, etc., roll-the-penny, hoopla, and pull-the-string stalls. If you pulled the right string in these last, there was, hopefully, a prize at the other end, were all announced in shrieking letters on 8-sheet bills at the doors. Machine games of all kinds, too, were there, on which you could play a one-legged, frustrating kind of football, shoot cats off a back green wall, or perhaps witness an execution as the grim prison gates opened to reveal the stiff and jerky spectacle of the unfortunate wretch being hanged, guillotined, or electrocuted. Others might show a haunted mansion with all kinds of ghostly appearances, from secret panels, trapdoors, oak chests, grandfather clocks, or even 4-poster beds. Some of these spectacles, I remember, were cleverly painted, others not so. Or perhaps a fireman, Victorian style, with beard and brass helmet, who shot up a ladder at a highly improbable speed to rescue a child from a burning house. There was also No show without punch, the crane, whose triple-jawed grab hoisted, or was supposed to hoist, attractive prizes from a sea of jelly beans, as happens to this day in such places. A snare and a delusion, if ever there was. The lines of the grab were so slack that it never took a grip of any of the prizes. Its counterpart, which stood for years on the east concourse of Waverley Station, was exactly the same. The odd single jelly bean, usually carrying an uneatable fur of dust, wouldn't make any dent in whatever profits these monsters toted up. Another much publicized feature of this hall of dubious pleasure was the fasting lady. She, it appeared from the huge linen banners outside, and tacked on the screen inside, was attempting a record fast of 48 days and nights. "Will she do it?" shouted the banners. It seemed she couldn't, and was finally removed to hospital to recuperate. The amusement enterprise lasted perhaps 18 months, perhaps not even so long, then folded up. It had been known as Joytown during this time, and when another similar establishment opened with the same name in St. Mary Street, in the shop now occupied by Gertrude Display, it might just have been the same bunch. After this, the place lay empty for 2 years, after which it was taken over by the Salvation Army, and finally opened in 1935 as the Congress Hall, replacing their former Southside headquarters in the old church in West Cross Causeway. If you're a cinema historian, the building is interesting, as it has altered but little since 1931. Foyer, auditorium and balcony are pretty much as they were then. The only alteration, so the commanding officer told me, has been the extension of the stage to take a full band and singers, perhaps I should say songsters, and some rooms at the rear. The building has, I believe, a back door into Hill Square, which hasn't been used for years. Little has changed out in the foyer. The pay box is still there on the left, although its guichet has gone, and the beveled glass doors survive, though the inner pair have been flushed with small leaded panes carrying the initials S.A. Double doors replaced the outer trellis gates years ago, but that, I'd say, would be the sum total of change since silent days. At the time of writing, the building's under offer, from whom we aren't told, but I could think of better uses for it than as offices or storage for the university or the Surgeon's Hall.